All right, now before we dive into Polyend Play, let's just talk about the overall structure so we know it's loaded anytime that we're using the instrument. Anytime you're playing with Polyend Play, you are working within a single project. Right now I have a project loaded, and within this project I have some samples. If I want to see those samples, we can see that there's knobs up here at the top. All these knobs are touch sensitive. I can just simply touch the knob to access the parameters that are available. And each knob gives me access to two different sets of parameters, and I can see that they're split up on the screen over here. I currently have it set up so I can access each one of these parameters by pressing the buttons on the left side of the screen, just because it gives me a bit more control. We'll talk about changing some of these preferences later. But right now, in my project, I have a bunch of samples that are loaded. And these are all loaded into specific folders, which is pretty important, and we'll discuss that pretty soon. Now, if I look below the knobs here, I can see Polyend Play is dominated by a bunch of lovely little pads here. To the left, there's a 16x8 grid, and each one of these horizontal rows represents a lane or a track. And I have a little pattern that's currently loaded up. If I want to select all the steps in a track, I can use these 4 columns over here to the right. Each button will let me do something specific to that current track. So I can press this to highlight all the steps in the track. I can press this button here to mute the current track. I can press this button to solo the current track. And I can press this button to access variations. Now, right now, I'm currently within a single pattern. And in this single pattern, we see that there's 16 steps. If I hold Shift, I can access up to 4 pages of 16 steps, and I can make these any number that I want between 1 and 64. If I want to add some variations within this single pattern, I can press this button, and each one of these pads gives me access to that many more steps within this pattern where I can do a completely different variation that only affects this particular track lane, which is pretty cool because in addition to that, if I press the patterns button, I have 128 patterns that I can easily jump between or I can chain together. So that's a lot of potential sequencing goodness there for you to access. Now, what I'm looking at here are 8 audio tracks. So with these 8 audio tracks, I can sequence monophonic samples and do a lot of fun tricks with that. If we look here under the pattern button, anything that you see written in lowercase, we can access by holding Shift. And then this brings me to MIDI tracks. So I also have 8 different tracks for MIDI, and I can send MIDI over USB or over a mini jack connection. Let's go back to our audio tracks. There we go. So all this is contained within a single project. All right. Also within the project, we have a performance mode here where we have multiple effects that we can access. Each one of these dual columns that's set to a specific color lets us access specific effects, and we can apply these effects to whatever lanes are selected. All right, so now with that, we understand what is within a single project. Let's go ahead and look at some potential samples that we can get loaded. But before we do that, it's probably important to make sure that you understand a few different quirks to this machine in terms of how navigation works, and to make sure that you set it up exactly to your liking. So let's check out some user settings next.